Chapter 6. She was short, she was furry, she was loud, and she was determined to sell him a melon. Sorry, Wedge Antilles said, moving away as best he could in the press of the crowded Morisham marketplace, holding his hands palms outward in front of him. Not interested in Waku melons today, thanks. Either the female Moorish didn't understand basic, or else she wasn't ready to concede defeat quite yet. She followed along with him behind her produce table, paralleling his retreat, thrusting the double bulbous pale red melon towards him and jabbering away non-stop in her own language. Not today, Wedge repeated firmly, looking around and trying to catch a glimpse of any of his Rogue Squadron teammates in the crowd of shoppers. Jansen and Tycho were supposed to know a little of the Moorish language, but neither of them was anywhere to be seen. But there was a gap freshly opened up in the pedestrian traffic pattern beside him. Maybe tomorrow, he called to the Waku seller, and made his escape. For a big bad X-Wing warrior, you're sure rotten at saying no, Jansen's voice said from behind him. I didn't buy it, did I? Wedge countered, turning to face his grinning teammate. Where were you when I needed you? Oh, I caught most of the show, Jansen said, grinning a little wider. I especially liked the part where you gave her that palms outward sign. Wedge felt his eyes narrow. That doesn't mean no here? Not quite, Jansen said, clearly enjoying himself. It means you don't want it at that price, but that she might want to try a better offer. Oh, well, thanks for telling me that going in, Wedge growled. No wonder she wouldn't leave me alone. It's a big galaxy, Jansen said philosophically. There's so much out there to learn. Come on, I ran into an old friend of yours over here. As long as he doesn't try to sell me something, Wedge grumbled as Jansen led his way through the shoppers. Any word from the base? Hardly, Jansen said over his shoulder. The meeting only started half an hour ago. With the General of Bella Bliss's standing, they probably haven't even gotten through the preliminary compliments yet. Here we go. Hey, General! A few people away, a distinguished-looking man in the black cloak turned around. Well, well, Wedge said, easing through the passers-by and offering his hand. General Calrissian. It's just plain Calrissian now, Lando Calrissian corrected, tucking the Waku melon he was carrying under one arm and gripping Wedge's hand. My military days are long behind me. Good to see you again, Wedge. You too, Wedge said. What are you doing in this part of the galaxy? Open for a chance to talk to General Bella Bliss, Lando said, nodding his head back towards the pyramidal launch towers of the New Republic Starfighter base rising up behind the city. We've got to do something about the pirate activity we've been getting out near Varn. Been hitting your ore shipments, have they? Wedge asked. That and scaring away potential customers, Lando said. I don't know if you knew I added the casino and observation gallery to the deep pockets. Sounds like a really big draw, Jansen said dryly. You'd be surprised how interesting underwater mining is to watch, Lando told him. Actually, at full capacity, the casino could probably pay the overhead for the whole operation all by itself. But not if everyone's afraid to come there. Pirate gangs have been coming out of the stonework just about everywhere, Wedge agreed. Even in the core systems. Have you tried talking to Coruscant? Till my voice gave out, Lando said sourly. Didn't gain me a thing. The bureaucratic bit sorters there are as bad as the ones we had under the Empire. Jansen snorted. Some of them are the same ones. This latest policy reorganization should help, Wedge said, trying to steer the conversation away from what was a permanent sore point for him and his Rogue Squadron comrades. Shifting the bulk of political power back down to systems and sector levels is definitely the way to go. The Empire already proved the centralized approach doesn't work. He looked up at the clear blue sky overhead. Funny, isn't it, how things wind up? I remember when being in a system this close to the edge of Imperial space meant you slept in your X-Wing. Instead, here we are, strolling along like we were on Svivrin or Ord Mantell. I wouldn't get too overconfident if I were you, Jansen warned. The Empire isn't exactly dead yet. They could still deliver a pretty good punch if they wanted to. And they've looked like they were ready to throw in their cards before, Lando added. Remember what things were like just before our Grand Admiral Thrawn came back from wherever it was he'd been hiding? Wedge? A voice called over the din. Hey, Wedge! Wedge peered over the crowd, caught a glimpse of tousled light brown hair, and lifted a hand. Over here! Who's that? Lando asked, craning his neck to peer over the crowd. His name's Tycho Selchu, Wedge told him. One of my Rogue Squadron people. I don't know if you ever met him. Tycho reached them. Hey, Wedge, you gotta come hear this guy, he said, his voice and face dark. Come on, he's over here. He led them through the marketplace to a small booth with a wizened Morlish hunched over it. Here he is, Tycho said, gathering the others in front of the booth. Simpi Protu? Mirish Kavish for real, the Moorish wheezed. Mishish Kama, por Krivish Beroth. Jansen whistled softly. What is it? Wedge asked. He says new information's just been dug up about the destruction of Kamas, Tycho said grimly, and that it was the Bothans who were responsible. Wedge stared at Tycho. You must be joking, he said. Do I look like I'm joking? Tycho bit out, a fire in his blue eyes. Figures, doesn't it? Endor, Borlius, and now this. Take it easy, Wedge said, putting some parade ground steel into his voice. Borlius wasn't really the Bothan's fault. Tycho's shoulders shifted uneasily. Not all of it, anyway, he conceded grudgingly. Wedge looked at Lando. Have you heard anything about fresh Kamas information? Not a whisper, Lando said, eyeing the Moorish suspiciously. Ask him where he heard it. Right. Tycho spoke to the Moorish again. Got an answer. He says it came from the Old Recluse, he translated. He lives up in a cave in the High Tatmana. Apparently, he knows everything about what goes on in the galaxy. Wedge turned and looked up at the Tatmana Mountains, rising in a sawtooth crest in the distance on the opposite side of the city from the New Republic base. On the face of it, it was absurd to think that some old native hermit would have any idea what was going on even in the city down here, let alone in the larger galaxy above his mountains. But on the other hand, Wedge had hung around Luke Skywalker long enough to know that there were a lot of unexplainable things in the galaxy. Maybe this old recluse was one of those latent force users Luke was always trying to find. And it wasn't like they were exactly busy right now anyway. Ask him where we can find this old recluse, he instructed Tycho. You going up there? Lando asked as Tycho began talking to the Moorish again. What in the world's for? Curiosity, Wedge told him. We've got time. The General won't be needing us for at least a few more hours. You coming? Lando sighed. Lead the way. Leaning slightly into the steady wind, the three X-Wings settled smoothly onto the bluff overlooking the city. Easy for you, Lando muttered under his breath, mentally gauging the chunk of space they'd left him to put the Lady Luck down onto. It would be tight, but pride alone dictated he not back out now. Muttering some more, he eased the yacht down towards the bluff. It was indeed a tight squeeze, made all the trickier by the wind, but he managed it without too much trouble and, more importantly, without any embarrassment. Dropping the engines into their standby settings, he climbed down the ladder just after the cockpit bridge and headed for the yacht's hatchway. Wedge, Jansen, and Tycho were waiting for him at the foot of the Lady Luck's ramp. Chilly up here, he commented, gripping the edge of his cloak to keep it from flapping. I hope the old recluse's cave is heated. At least it'll be out of this wind, Jansen agreed, pointing towards a narrow 2-meter high crack in the cliff face. That must be it. Let's go. The cave was much deeper than Lando would have guessed from the relatively small size of the entrance. It was also surprisingly warm. Looks like a glow up ahead, Wedge said, his voice sounding odd in the enclosed space. Around that bend. I wonder if we should announce ourselves, Lando said, glancing around uneasily. Flying in cramped spaceships had never bothered him in the least, but walking down a narrow passageway with the top of a mountain weighing down on him was something else entirely. Or maybe it was that the place reminded him too much of the inside of Mount Tantus. Either way, as they rounded the corner, he found his right hand resting on the grip of his holstered blaster, which made the scene that opened up in front of them just that much more anticlimactic. Sitting at the back of a widened section of the cave was a single ancient Moorish, even older than the one they'd talked to at the booth, meditatively plucking the stretched wires of some kind of musical instrument. To his right was a squat military surplus worklight. To his left, an antique wood brazier. On both sides of the cave, only vaguely touched by the worklight's glow, were a collection of objects that were apparently the old recluse's household goods. At his back, not quite covering the cave's back wall, was a hand decorated curtain of heavy looking cloth. If the old recluse was surprised to see them, he didn't show it. He studied them for a moment in silence as they stepped within a couple meters of him, then dropped his gaze back to his instrument and muttered something in his own language. He's greeting us, Tycho translated. Sort of. He also demands to know what we want. Tell him we've heard he knows something about the destruction of Kamas, Wedge said. We'd like to hear more. He'll want money, Jansen warned. Right, Tycho agreed. Try offering him 50. The Moorish stirred. 300, he said in clear and nearly unaccented basic. This story is worth 300. Well, well, Wedge said dryly. So much for local color. I thought they probably spoke more basic than they were letting on. I'll give you 100. 300, the old recluse insisted. Or no story. 150, Wedge offered. New Republic currency. All I have on me. 300. No less. I'll cover it, Lando spoke up, looking around the cave. There was something odd about this place. Something that was triggering some very unpleasant memories. All right, Wedge sighed. 300 it is, but this had better be worth it. It is, the old recluse assured him. As the dark battle fleet assembled outside Kamas, and suddenly it clicked in the back of Lando's mind. Stepping around behind the brazier, he got a grip on the edge of the curtain. Kali! The Moorish screeched, tossing aside his musical instrument and lunging towards the worklight. His hand darted beneath it. Freeze it! Wedge snapped. All three Rogue Squadron pilots had dropped into combat crouches, blasters in their hands and steady on the Moorish. Bring your hand out, Wedge ordered. Empty. Slowly, glaring at them, the old recluse pulled his hand back out. Jansen circled over to the worklight and crouched down beside it, coming up with a small but nasty-looking blaster. All right, Wedge said as Jansen returned to Tycho's side. Now you just sit there and be good, and keep your hands where we can see them. Holstering his blaster, he walked around behind his teammates and came over to Lando. What did you find? The source of his omniscience, Lando said grimly, pulling the curtain aside. Take a look. Wedge whistled softly under his breath, and even Lando, who had more or less known what to expect, had to admit he was impressed. Crammed into a wide floor-to-ceiling crack in the back wall of the cave was a fully functioning Imperial Communications Center, complete with encrypt-decrypt modules, the input jacks for a variety of droids and sensor feeds, a space-to-planetary monitor module, and a self-contained Generations 3 power generator. Well, well, Wedge commented. Nice find, Lando. What tipped you off? The smell, Lando told him, an involuntary shiver running through him. Dusty electronics have a smell like nothing else in the universe. The Sparty cylinder chamber in Mount Tantus storehouse was reeking with it. Probably set this place up just before we took Morishim back from them, Jansen suggested. Must have used it to spy on the base. And for propaganda and incitement of the locals, Wedge said, pushing aside the curtain for a closer look. There's a direct feed to the Imperial News Service here, and a direct feed to Coruscant Hourly. Might be interesting to have someone go back through the recent history records, Lando said. See if we can spot their hand in events. Yes, Wedge agreed. They must have abandoned it in a hurry to have left this much stuff around. He trailed off, frowning at the space monitor display. Tycho, get out to your X-Wing and give the base a call. Looks like we've got a Corellian Corvette coming in, broadcasting an Imperial ID. Abruptly, he stiffened. Belay that, he snapped, dropping the curtain and charging past the Old Recluse. Get to your fighters! Double time! The others fell into step behind him, the group disappearing around the bend in the tunnel. What is it? The Old Recluse demanded anxiously. You! Human! What is it? A single look at the display wall was all that Lando needed. It's an Imperial Star Destroyer, he said. It dropped in right behind the Corvette. Heading this way. Lando? Wedge's voice came from the Lady Luck's console. You reading me? Loud and clear, Lando said, making one last adjustment to the speaker control. Stay close, Wedge warned. This freak Mexican trick won't work against their jamming if we get too far apart. Got it, Lando said, eyeing the confused readouts from his comm board. His comm system was pretty much state-of-the-art, with a few exotic add-ons besides, but it wasn't really set up to deal with New Republic military frequencies and encrypts. But so far the jury rig he'd thrown together on the fly seemed to be holding. What's happening? I got through to the base while you were getting set up, Wedge said. The rest of Rogue Squadron's on the way, along with every starfighter the base can scramble. A couple of wings of X-wings and A-wings against an Imperial Star Destroyer. Terrific. What about the Peregrine and the assault frigate that Admiral Risk came in with? The Peregrine's on its way, but it's having to come from around the far side of the planet, Wedge said, an edge of contempt creeping into the cool professionalism in his voice. The assault frigate, unfortunately, is going to be out of it. Apparently, they let the systems drop a little too far past standby. Sloppy, Lando grunted. Who's in command? A committee of bagmims, Wedge told him. The crew is mostly bagmims, humans, and Pavananians. Bagmims are pretty good fighters when they get riled. They should have stayed more riled then, Wedge said. Right now, they're just a waste of air. Too late to worry about it now, Lando said, carefully refraining from reminding Wedge about his own earlier comments on how much more relaxed things had become. What's the plan? We try to slow them down, Wedge said. The Peregrine's on its way, and the General's got 2 star cruisers coming from Haverling. Until they get here, we're on our own. The 3 X-wings and the yacht rose above the curve of Morisham's horizon, and there they were, the awe-inspiring bulk of the Imperial Star Destroyer with the Corvette leading it towards the planet. And then Lando frowned. Wedge? I see it, Wedge murmured. Rogue 7, give me a fast analysis. No mistake, Rogue Leader, Tycho's voice came promptly. Those aren't accidental misfires. The Star Destroyer is definitely targeting the Corvette. The Corvette's running flank speed with full aft deflector shields. She's being chased, all right. They're jamming her transmissions, too, Jansen added. Course projection shows she's making straight for the edge of the base's energy shield. Looks like we got a theft and defection on our hands. Could be, Wedge said cautiously. It could also be a trick to get us to let an unexamined ship in under the energy shield. So what do we do? Jansen asked. Let's try running a little interference, Wedge said. Rogue 2, Rogue 5. Cut it around the Corvette's starboard side and see if you can draw some of the Star Destroyer's attention. I'll take the other side. Watch out for tractor beams. They may try to pull the Corvette in. Copy, Rogue Leader. The 2 X-Wings swerved smoothly away from Wedge and Lando. What about me? Lando asked. Better stay back here, Wedge told him, putting on a burst of speed of his own. That yacht isn't designed for this sort of maneuvering. Anyway, we may need you to act as a relay between us and our reinforcements. The words were barely out of his mouth when there was a sort of muffled flash from the Corvette, accompanied by a cloud of debris. Topside sensor group's been hit, Jansen reported. Internal fire. Probably going to have to shut down the main reactor core. Which meant no drive, no shields, and no hope of escape. Lando swore under his breath, keying his secondary comm system to scan across the channels. Static hissed out at him at each of the frequencies the Imperials were jamming. Tractor beam activated, Tycho said tightly. Making connection. They've got her. Incoming to aft, Jensen cut in. The rest of Rogue Squadron plus 3 wings of A-Wings and 2 of X-Wings. ETA about 4 minutes. Wedge's sigh was a softer echo of the jamming hiss. Too little, too late, he said reluctantly. Break off. There's nothing we can do to help 'em now. Lando looked out at the Corvette, tapping a frustrated fist gently against the edge of his control board. Muzzled and helpless both, the Corvette would be taken or destroyed without anyone knowing who they were or what they were doing here. Unless... Wedge, he called. I've got an idea. Fire up all the transmission frequencies the 3 of you can handle. Full power, with all the encryption you can put on them. Maybe we can dilute their jamming enough for us to at least get something out of the Corvette. Worth a try, Wedge said. Let's do it, rogues. Lando swiveled around to the comm board, keying in one of those exotic add-ons he'd spent all that good money for. This probably wouldn't work. Almost certainly wouldn't work, in fact, and the effort alone might easily irritate the Imperials into taking a lethal swipe at him. But at least it was doing something. He stared at the comm readings, holding his breath. And then, to even his gambler's amazement, there was a flicker of something through the static. Keep it up, he shouted to Wedge and the others, keying madly at the board. The flicker strengthened, faded, strengthened again. It cut off suddenly. Lando looked up just in time to catch a final glimpse of pseudo-motion as the Star Destroyer vanished into hyperspace. Well, that's that, Tycho said. I wasn't watching, Lando said. Did they take the Corvette with them? Pulled it into the bay and took straight off, Wedge told him. You get anything? I don't know, Lando said, keying for replay. Let's see. There was a burst of static, and then, almost buried beneath the hissing, a few faint words could be heard. Is Colonel... It's... Echelon Envoy from... Morel... On. Sent here. Ontac Gen... Ella Bliss. Concern. Ego. But... Empire and New Republic. Under attack. Traitorous Ella... The Empire. Do not expect... Revive. If the new to hold... At... Pel... At the abandoned... Mining sent... Itched in... To meet with... Peating. This is... No... Vermo. The recording ended. Not much there, Wedge commented. No, Lando conceded. What now? You'd better head back and get that recording to General Bella Bliss, Wedge said. I think we'll stay out here a little while longer. In case this was just the first act, Lando suggested. You never know. Lando gazed out at where the Corvette had lost its race for safety, an unpleasant chill running up his spine. The whole thing was very similar, disturbingly similar, in fact, to the race Princess Leia Organa's consular ship had lost to Darth Vader's Star Destroyer above the planet Tatooine nearly 2 decades ago. It had been a pivotal point in the struggle against the Empire's tyranny, although no one had noted at the time. And now, here over Morisham, the same scene had just been played out again. Could there have been something of equal consequence behind it? Wedge? Yes? There weren't by any chance. Lando hesitated, afraid this was going to sound silly. Any escape pods jettisoned from that Corvette? Actually, that's the first thing I thought of, Wedge told him soberly. But no, there weren't. Didn't think so, Lando said, shaking away the memories of the past. History never truly repeated itself, after all. Odds were that Jansen had already called it, a simple theft and defection. The odds also were that none of them would ever know for sure. Officially, the planet was named Munilist. Unofficially, it was known to many as Moneyland. And if Bastion was the political center of the Empire, Munilist was its financial core. The reasons for its status were many and varied, a long history that dated back well into the days of the Old Republic. The fact that it still retained its role in these darker times was as much a triumph of inertia and habit as it was the two Golan 3 defense platforms tracing their lazy orbits high overhead. Standing at the conference room window, Pelion glanced up as one of the platforms passed in front of Munilit's sun, momentarily dimming its light. Back when the Imperial capital was moved to Bastion, he remembered, Moff Disra had tried to get those two Golden Threes transferred there as well, arguing that the Empire's governmental center deserved the protection more than the credit shufflers did. It had been one of Disra's rare miscalculations, and one of his most embarrassing political defeats. Behind Pelion, someone coughed discreetly. Yes? Pelion asked, turning again to face the table. All six of the senior officers gathered around the table were looking back at him. I presume, Admiral, High General Sut Ramik said quietly, that this is not simply a trial suggestion. You and the Moffs have already agreed on this offer, haven't you? For a moment, Pelion studied the other's face. General Ramik, commander of one of the Golans up there, was the senior man of the Mutilant's defense setup, in experience and respect as well as in rank. If he chose to resist the proposed peace agreement, the others would most likely fall in line behind him. But no, the question hadn't been a challenge, merely a question. The Moffs have approved it, yes, he said. For what it's worth, they were no more pleased by the idea than any of the rest of us are. I thought you were the one who made the proposal, General Jaren Kite put in, his voice and eyes dark with suspicion. How can you say now that you oppose it? I didn't say I opposed it, Pelion corrected him. I said I didn't like it. But in my professional judgment, we simply have no other options left. I was under the impression we had revolutionary new systems and equipment ready to come online, Ramik said. With perfect timing, one of the lights on Pelion's comm blinked on. Some of those systems haven't proved as workable as their designers had hoped, Pelion said, stepping to his seat and leaning over to tap the confirmation button. As for the equipment, some of it has been tainted by decidedly treasonous activities. Across from Pelion, the conference door slid open, and a lean man wearing the traditional Munilicity banker's shawl and a pendant stepped inside. His reaction to the room full of officers might have been interesting, but Pelion wasn't watching him. His eyes were instead on the officers themselves, as their expressions of surprise or indignation at his veiled accusation were interrupted by this unexpected intrusion. They turned, most of them obviously irritated, to see who it was who presumed to intrude on fleet business. And midway down the left side of the table, General Kite twitched. It wasn't a big reaction, little more than a twitch of the head and a flicker of shock across his face before he got himself back under control. But set against the backdrop of the other's more or less indifferent curiosity, it stood out like a guide light on a landing bay. Ah, Lord Grayman, Pelion said, focusing on the banker at last. Thank you for coming. If you'll wait in the other room there, I'll be with you shortly. As you wish, Admiral Pelion, Grayman said. His eyes, Pelion noted, flicked once to Kite as he crossed to the inner chamber and disappeared inside. And what was that all about? Ramik asked. The man was shrewd, all right. Clearly he'd recognized that the banker's interruption wasn't entirely a coincidence. I was speaking of treason, Pelion said, waving a hand towards the inner chamber. Lord Grayman is one of the threads in that web. A fresh ripple of surprise ran around the rest of the table, but Ramik himself didn't even twitch. You can prove this? He demanded. Enough of it, Pelion said. He's one of the money men helping funnel Imperial funds to a consortium that's building the Preybirds that are now supplementing the more traditional TIE-class starfighters aboard our ships. I don't see any treason in that, someone snorted. Seems to me that the Empire's getting its money's worth with those Preybirds. The treason is in the fact that the deal has been made outside proper channels, Pelion said, and in the fact that certain high Imperial officers are siphoning off a significant percentage of those funds for their own personal gain. Deliberately, he turned his gaze on Kite. And in the fact that the deal includes the supplying of Imperial equipment and personnel to various pirate gangs. Kite held his gaze without flinching, but his face paled just noticeably. Pelion knew all right, and now Kite knew that he knew. And how do you expect your treaty with the New Republic to stop this? Ramek asked. Cooperation and open lines of communication would enable us to track down the participants more efficiently, Pelion said. And those participants would no longer be able to pretend they were merely doing the Empire's business in their own, shall we say, creative way. Then you suspect some in the fleet are involved? One of the others asked. I don't suspect, Pelion said. I know. For a long moment, no one spoke. Pelion let the silence linger and harden, then gestured to the datapads in front of them. But that's not the issue here today. The issue is the proposed peace treaty, and whether you will support it. I suggest we adjourn for an hour so that you'll have time to consider all the ramifications. Discuss it amongst yourselves if you like. I'll be here if you have any questions you wish to ask privately. He looked at each of them in turn. At the end of that hour, we'll reconvene, and I'll expect your answers. Any final questions? Very well, then. Dismissed. He turned again to the window, his back to the table, as they gathered their datapads and data cards and exited quietly from the room. The doors slid shut, and Pelion took a careful breath. Your comments? He asked, turning around again. Ramek hadn't moved from his seat. I disagree completely, the High General said bluntly. The New Republic is going to self-destruct. You know it, and I know it. The only questions are how violent the explosion will be and whether the trigger will be this Kamas thing we keep hearing about, or something else. There's no need for us to humiliate ourselves in front of aliens and alien lovers this way. I understand your position, Pelion said. Is that your final word? Ramek's thin lips compressed briefly. I don't support your treaty, Admiral, he said, standing up. But I'm an Imperial officer, and I will obey my superiors. You and the Moffs have agreed. If and when the order to cease hostilities is given, I will obey it. Some of the weight on Pelion's shoulders eased a bit. Thank you, General, he said quietly. Thank my family and its history of proud service, Ramek countered. They're the ones who instilled the sense of duty and loyalty in me. He dropped his gaze to the table and set about gathering together his data cards. Do you think the New Republic will accept your offer of a meeting? We'll find out soon enough, Pelion said. Colonel Vermal should be reaching the Morisham system just about now. Yes, Ramek murmured. He started for the door, paused and turned back. You're certain there are pirate gangs involved in all this? There's no doubt at all, Pelion assured him. From what I've been able to piece together, they've been hired to attack excuse me, let me restart that line. There's no doubt at all, Pelion assured him. From what I've been able to piece together, they're being hired to attack specified New Republic shipments. They get the booty, the Empire gets a degree of confusion and consternation in the New Republic, and the Shadow Partners, knowing which shipments are going to be hit, make money on the business and commodity exchanges. Ramek shrugged. Aside from that last, it sounds like perfectly reasonable privateer activity. Perhaps, Pelion conceded. The problem is that the ultimate decisions on which shipments are to be hit are coming from the Shadow Partners, not the High Command or Imperial Intelligence. And there are also strong indications that the sleeper cells Grand Admiral Thrawn set up are being raided to provide crewers for the gangs. If those alleged sleeper cells really exist, Ramek rumbled. I've never been convinced of that myself. If the troopers aren't from the sleeper cells, then the conspirators are getting them from somewhere else, Pelion said. The only other choice is that they're siphoning them off from the regular line forces. Ramek's face hardened. If they're doing that, I'll personally help you flay the perpetrators. We don't have enough troopers and crewers as it is. His eyes narrowed slightly. And which of us do you suspect of being in on it with Lord Grayman? General Kite was the only one who reacted to his entrance, Pelion said. As such, he's my prime suspect. With luck, he may panic and lead my intelligence team to some of the others involved. Kite won't panic, Rennick said, but he might think it wise to alert them. Either way will suit me, Pelion said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to spend a few minutes with Lord Grayman. Pulling on another thread of the web? Pelion smiled grimly. Something like that. I'll see you and the others in an hour. Very well, sir. For a moment, Rammick studied his face. I'd advise you to be careful, though. Every web has something nasty in the middle, and whoever's in the middle of this one could well decide that with the peace treaty in the works, the Empire doesn't need a Supreme Fleet Commander anymore, especially one who's pulling pieces out of his web. Pelion looked over at the room where Lord Grayman waited. Yes, he said, quietly. That thought had occurred to me. The secret door slid open, and Dizra looked up as Tierce strode into the room. Well, he demanded, did you get through to Dorja? Finally, yes, Tierce nodded. He reports the mission was more or less successful. More or less? Tierce shrugged. Dorja said he had full spectrum jamming going from the moment he emerged from hyperspace, but that some of Colonel Vermal's signal might have gotten through before they took his corvette aboard. Dizra hissed between his teeth. Sloppy. That observation has already been expressed to him by our Grand Admiral, Tierce said. Apparently, there were some X-Wings and an unidentified yacht off Morisham that happened to be hanging around the corvette's incoming vector when he dropped out of hyperspace. Dizra snorted. In my experience, X-Wings don't just happen to hang around places. I agree, Tierce said. My guess is that they spotted the incoming ship somehow and went out to take a look. Possibly using the old Imperial spy center we abandoned on the surface, though how they would have located it I don't know. Did Dorja have any idea how much of Vermal's message might have gotten through? A few words at the most, Tierce assured him. And that assumes one or more of the nearby ships even had the right equipment, which is unlikely. Dizra pondered. Yes, he conceded. And even if they did, a few words aren't going to grab anyone's attention. No one who counts, anyway. Especially considering how many other crises are about to come down on their heads, Tierce agreed. Right, Dizra said. What did you have Dorja do with the ship and crew? He's currently en route back here, doing a quick interrogation on the way. Most of the crew, I suspect, will have had no idea what Vermal's mission was. Those we could bring back into service with vague intimations that Vermal was up to some sort of treason. As for Vermal himself, he shrugged. I thought we'd lock him up somewhere quiet for the moment. We might find a use for him later. Sounds reasonable, Dizra said. Any word from Trezin and the others? We've received their last scheduled report, Tierce said. They'll be out of contact from now until summoned. Dizra grunted. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. And yet, this whole thing with Vermal and his possibly leaked message bothered him somehow. Surely no one could have caught any of it, and even if they had, surely they would dismiss it out of hand as smugglers or a simple theft and defection attempt gone bad. It occurs to me, Major, he said slowly, that perhaps we ought to push up our timetable a little, just in case. There was a long moment of silence. I suppose that would be possible, Tierce said, but I really don't think it's necessary. No one's going to pay any attention to the incident over Morisham. Dizra stared hard at him. You're certain of that? Tierce smiled thinly. I guarantee it. The recording ran through to the end for the third time, and finally General Garm Bella Bliss shut it off. About as clear as roiled mud, he commented to Lando. Still, I would have bet you couldn't have gotten even this much without through all that jamming. Very nicely done. I just wish we'd gotten more, Lando said. Jensen figured it was probably a theft and defection gone wrong. Yes, it does look that way, Bella Bliss said, fingering his mustache thoughtfully. But somehow, I don't think it was. Lando eyed him. Then what was it? I don't know yet, Bella Bliss said, but consider the facts. The Empire hasn't got nearly enough Imperial Star Destroyers left to waste on one simple chase mission. And they wanted them taken alive. And they wanted to make sure he didn't talk to anyone. And he knew you were here, Lando pointed out. You can almost hear the words General Bella Bliss in there. Yes, Bella Bliss agreed. Though keeping track of my whereabouts is no big deal anymore. We don't keep things nearly as secret as we did even 5 years ago. He swiveled over to his computer and began punching keys. It seems to me you can also hear the name Vermal mentioned. If I remember right, there was an Imperial officer of that name on Admiral Pelian's staff. Lando looked out the viewport at the curve of the planet below, and at the distant flares of the X-Wings still circling around in the distance. Seems to me that would add weight to the defection theory, he suggested. They wouldn't want to kill someone of that rank out of hand, and they certainly wouldn't want us to know he'd tried it. Perhaps, Bella Bliss peered at the display. Yes, there he is. Colonel Mays Vermal. Lando spread his hands. There it is, then. Bella Bliss fingered his mustache again. No, he said slowly. My instincts still say no. Why use a Corellian corvette if you were going to defect? Why not something faster or more heavily armed, or requiring a smaller crew, unless all 100-odd crewers were defecting together? I don't know. I don't know either. Bella Bliss slid out the data card of Lando's recording. But I think I'll make a few copies of this and see if I can find out. Lando cocked an eyebrow. In all your copious spare time? The general shrugged. I've been needing a hobby anyway. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.